Why is this not? Um, Tech person? So I have it's going red each time. I try. There's a tech. Oh, it works. Okay. Hi, everyone. We'll give about 30 more seconds and we'll get started. Thank you all for being here.
So you're just pressing this red button?
Before we start, while we wait to get going, just letting everyone on WebEx know that we ask people attending to please attending remotely to please mute your mics for your colleagues. We have taken questions that were submitted in advance from those attending remotely. So with that, I think we're all here. I think we can get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for being here. We're very excited for the next phase of this work, and we're grateful to have a nearly packed house and for so many people who are joining us remotely. I'm Jesse Levine, Senior Advocacy Officer for Scholars at Risk, and I'm delighted to be here. For those who don't know, Scholars at Risk is an international NGO dedicated to protecting academic freedom and supporting threatened scholars, students, and higher education spaces around the world. I'd like to begin by thanking Portugal, the European Union, Colombia, Wallonia, Brussels, Belgium, and the Office of the Special Rapporteur for the Right to Education for co-sponsoring today's event and for their partnership in our broader mission. I want to acknowledge in particular Portugal for their leadership in the drafting and development of the upcoming resolution on the right to education. And I especially want to acknowledge Farida Shahid in her historic mandate as Special Rapporteur on the right to education. Since the start of her mandate with her incredible staff, Dr. Shahid has been a consistent and stalwart champion of academic freedom. She has significantly advanced the doctrine surrounding academic freedom through her 2024 report, which examined the issue from a right to education perspective in unprecedented detail. She sounded the alarm on particular threats to academic freedom through country visits to the United States and Hungary, among others. And she's pushed toward concrete on-the-ground change through her support of the Principles for Implementing the Right to Academic Freedom, which I commend to all of you if you haven't read it. At the heart of her work over the past several years, and very much at the heart of Scholars at Risk's work, is a recognition of the fact that academic freedom and healthy universities and educational institutions are foundational to democracy, social progress, and scientific advancement. In other words, academic freedom is a human right, not just because it protects fundamental human characteristics like curiosity and the desire to learn, although it most certainly does that. It's also a human right because it ensures the functioning of the institutions that make other human rights possible. What today's event is about is further entrenching that recognition, even in the face of democratic decline, especially in the face of democratic decline. It's about advancing existing law and human rights norms, but just as importantly, it's about drilling down to the regional, state, and institutional levels to develop effective, on-the-ground responses to the threats and erosions that we're seeing on a daily basis. We'll first hear from Special Rapporteur Shahid, followed by the three directors of the three regional coalitions that are advancing academic freedom in partnership with Scholars at Risk and others. Those directors are Bensharat Seychua, the director of the Southeast Asia Coalition for Academic Freedom, Camila Croso, director of the Coalition for Academic Freedom in the Americas, Kwadwo Appiagie Atwa, director of the Africa Coalition for Academic Freedom. With that, I'm delighted to introduce Special Rapporteur Shahid. Special Rapporteur, the floor is yours.
And thank you for organizing this. You know, one of my very favorite phrases in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights is the freedom indispensable for scientific research and creative activity. And for me, academic freedom lies at the very heart of knowledge creation and artistic expression and everything else that goes with it. So last year, my report was done because of the growing number of violations taking place in every region of the world, where learners, educators, and researchers were silenced, sidelined, denied resources, and penalized because of the research they do, the questions they raise, the ideas they posit, and the sharing of those findings. And the patterns of violations include cyber attacks, retaliation, repression, imprisonment, sometimes even death, but also the closing down of their publications, the funding, in ending funding, etc. But many violations, patterns of violation, resemble the attacks that we have on a free and independent media, free civil society. And I think there are also a lot more subtle methods in which academic freedom is being suppressed. And I think we need to look at that too. It's not always in the press. These are administrative measures. There's a loss of job security. There's a closing down of subjects which are not being done. There's promotions. There's being blocked. So I think these are all. And curtailment, as Jesse just said, curtailing academic freedom really threatens democracy itself and all of humanity's creativity. And it's as crucial to democratic processes, and I keep repeating this, as a free press or independent judiciary. I think we need to, therefore, I'm really happy to be hearing here the regional approaches to advancing academic freedom and seeing how normative frameworks contribute to its protection and implementation across the world. Normative frameworks, I believe, are important because they contextualize the international standards regarding academic freedom in a manner that makes them implementable in a more effective and efficient way. They add information and depth to what the international standards say. Regional approaches are important since, as I mentioned in my report, academic freedom per se is not mentioned in any international human rights treaty per se. However, it is legally grounded in a number of provisions, and I call for its constitutional and legal recognition as an autonomous right at the national level, clarifying that it is applicable at all levels of education for educators, for researchers, for students. The principles for implementing the right to academic freedom, which have been drafted by a working group of UN experts, scholars, and civil society actors, and based on international law and practice, I think are extremely useful guidance for stakeholders about what the content of academic freedom is and the best ways to implement it. They articulate 9 essential aspects, which I think we will hear more about in detail, to substantially guarantee implementation. I think one of the important things that I want to stress, I know Jesse's going to say out of time, but I will just continue. It is crucial that regional approaches also adopt the comprehensive approach which is proposed in the principles. And I think that's something we should be look at, and also in my report. I think academic freedom to me is the freedom to access, disseminate, produce information, to think freely, to develop, express, apply, and engage with a diversity of knowledge within or related to one's field of expertise or field of study, regardless of whether it takes place inside or outside the academic community, inside or outside campuses, classrooms, etc., including engaging with the public. And I think there are 4 independent pillars, which I just want to talk about before closing. It's the right to teach, the right to engage in discussions and debates with persons and groups in the classrooms and campuses and outside the academic community, to conduct research, number 3, and fourthly, to disseminate opinions and research results without and with freedom. And I think everyone is entitled to this. I do want to emphasize my report also speaks about how academic freedom is essential from the primary level up. This is not something that suddenly in high school you say, oh, or at university, oh, let's give academic freedom. And the restriction, the curtailing of academic freedom is happening there when you're banning books, you're banning subjects, you're making it difficult. I've just been with a group of youngsters who say we fear to speak out. And these are high school students. They are fearful for speaking out if they have a different opinion. This is not what education is supposed to be. And this is certainly not certainly why academic freedom is so crucial at all levels of education regarding the right to, which is a fundamental right to education across the board. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Bencharat Sechua. I apologize. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Jesse. Now let us look at how the principle of academic freedom could be contextualized and implemented at the regional level. Coming from a region where there is no regional human rights mechanism and where academic freedom is not the widely understood concept, enforcement of international framework through legal means is useful, but might not be the immediate answer to the issue we are facing today. What also need to note in relation to the context of academic freedom in Southeast Asia is the fact that violation of academic freedom is not always outright, as we heard from Farida. We are in the region where critical thinking is not always valued and often suppressed. Apart from killings, violence, enforced disappearance, imprisonment, persecution, loss of position, and travel restriction, like in the Scholar at Risk Academic Freedom Monitoring Index, everyday academic work are also restricted through and controlled by the institution and national research policy, national security, national development goals, academic quality assurance system, the business model of education that values income generation and not knowledge production, among many other restrictions that we are facing on our day-to-day life. Books are banned, research on certain issues are not supported, be they the monarchy in Thailand, the military in Thailand and Indonesia, Myanmar, the religion, Buddhism in Thailand, Myanmar, Muslim in Islamic in Indonesia or other countries, or even climate change is a taboo topic and among research community in some countries. Not only the education is commercialized, but military is also interfering into education in some countries, not only by closing down the public discussion or seminar on certain academic issues. They are doing their own promotion of their narrative of what education should be. They are developing many education program and promoting that at the high school and university level. All these go on with little or no resistance from the academics or the student in our region. Academic freedom is not the generally accepted values. So, as with other international human rights principles, we cannot simply use the international framework or norms to insist that this is something universal that we all have to follow. But then how can we use the international framework in such a context? As Farida emphasized, that we need to work both inside and outside of academic community. I think it is important to popularize the concept of academic freedom, not only as a universal values or international human rights principle, because the global framework needs to be used to stir discussion and debates among the public, which will definitely be controversial and will include some resistance from certain forces within the society. But that is part of the construction of a new narrative and new norms, new values. We have to generate public recognition of the importance of education as space to generate critical knowledge and critical thinking, not as a space to produce the types of the citizen desired by the authoritarian regime. We have to create public awareness and collective forces that are ready to stand up to defend when such knowledge space is restricted. This should not be seen as the protection of the privileged few of the academics, as it is often perceived, but as the protection of the knowledge protection for the society. This also means we need to work together to promote broader human rights, and in particular, the freedom of expression and rights to assembly. For the more top-down approach, Our partners in the regions are now working to advocate for human rights-based university policy to be adopted by ASEAN universities. Such a policy would aim to create conducive environment within the whole university institution, where learning about, learning through, and learning for human rights is possible. Currently, many universities in the region have issued their own academic freedom policy. You can check their website. They proudly present those policies there. But just because that is part of the regional quality assurance criteria, those documents in most cases are meaningless because they are not implemented. They are just there to show off. So a human rights-based policy, a human rights-based university, if we can promote that, it will involve more action on what can be implemented within academic institution. So in sum, these two-pronged strategy involving working on the ground with movement building and public awareness, and from the top with the academic institution buy-in would be the way to go in a context where legal enforcement may not be possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Camila Croso, Director of our of the Coalition for Academic Freedom in the Americas.
Thank you so much. Is this working? Yes. Okay. Greetings from Brazil, and it's a huge pleasure to be here and see this packed room and the interest that this topic is leveraging within the United Nations. So I'm Camila Croso. I'm the director of the Coalition for Academic Freedom in the Americas, which was founded in 2021 by 3 institutions, Scholars at Risk, the University of Ottawa, and the University of Monterrey, and that now counts with more than 100 members across all the continent, crossing the North-South divide, which is a very exciting dimension of our coalitions, and building institutional partnerships across the regions and across the continents, as this panel shows. One element that I would like to highlight is that in our region, in the Americas, we do have the Inter-American Principles for Academic Freedom and University Autonomy, which were approved by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights also in 2021. I think that this marks a difference in terms of the region and the way in which we have a legal framework very much in tune with the international principles for implementing the right to academic freedom. And this gives us in the region, let's say, a legal grounding to be advocating for improving national legislation and policies and let's say raising the bar in terms of what are the parameters that should be pursued within each of the national countries in the region. The Inter-American Principles recognize academic freedom as an independent and interdependent right and really drive the idea that academic freedom is a pillar of democracy, as Farida rightly pointed out, and is one of our key messages. I'm happy to say that in the Inter-American Principles, this is very explicit. I also do want to say that in the Latin American region in particular, there is a history that dates way back to 1918, actually, and the Cordoba reform in Argentina, led by students that were calling back in those days for academic freedom, institutional university autonomy, and increased participation of students in decision-making. So it's an important thing to note because it means that even if we have so much to go still in the Americas and in Latin America, where the Cordoba reform actually took place, we have still a long room to go to see this implemented, but there is a background of let's say, movement building and student movement building in particular, where particularly the principle of university autonomy is more consolidated. I do want to highlight 6 key attacks that are very much present in our region. And that starts with particularly the attacks on autonomy, right? So even if there is this awareness that I mentioned or some history, attacks are growing. And when I speak of autonomy, I do refer to 4 dimensions of autonomy: pedagogical autonomy, So what is actually taught or not taught in schools, and I'll go a little bit deeper in a little moment on that. Physical autonomy, meaning that the violating the actual space with military forces and police forces. This is happening in many different countries across the regions, including my own country, Brazil, during the Bolsonaro government, where militarization of public schools, as Farid is saying, is not just universities, across all the levels of education, was a very strong reality. Autonomy in terms of governance, in terms of interference on naming who is the rector and deciding, really breaching that autonomy in terms of decision-making of who is leading the institutions. That is happening also, not just university, mainly university, but also at school level. And financial autonomy, which is a huge issue, and my second point that I wanted to drill. So the definancing of education is really a mechanism that is, let's say, weakening the possibility of academic freedom and institutional autonomy. The definancing of education goes hand in hand with a delegitimization of educational institutions, of higher education, of academia and academics, and it goes hand in hand with some sort of anti-science movements that is questioning really let's say, the structure and the science in itself, the validity of science in itself. A third problematic has to do with precarious contracts, again, fragilizing the academic profession and making the contract so precarious and so time-bound that really there is a huge amount of pressure to deliver in a certain direction in order to ensure actually even having a job. So insecurity is, let's say, a strategy that fragilizes academic freedom, and which goes hand in hand with a fourth point, which is the commodification of education and the role of market forces. So when you think of a situation where there's a definancing of education and a delegitimization of academia and precarious contracts, market forces really have much more power to determine what is taught, what is legitimate science, who is agenda setting, and so on. So again, this is a serious reality across our continent. Religious interference is another one that I want to highlight, in particular the rise of evangelical, let's say, influence across the region goes very much hand in hand with the forces that I have mentioned, the market forces, government forces, and religious forces really being entrenched in parliaments in many continents, and not just in parliament, but also as part of the basis of the communities. And therefore, it's both macro and entrenched in legislations and parliaments, but also micro at the community level, and how that influences also parents in particular, and how that unfolds into attacks to academic freedom, and in particular to gender dimension. And that's the last point that I want to mention. The attacks on gender in Latin America, there is a prevailing notion of, in inverted commas, gender ideology, which is a very pejorative way of talking about gender studies and gender justice, critical race theory in an enormous way in the United States, human rights as a whole, and climate and the environment are just some of the subject matters that are highly attacked. There are, nevertheless, some positive developments around jurisprudence against censorship, particularly around gender-related censorship, jurisprudence protecting the inviolability of academic spaces by police and military, protocols within universities that are being developed in some countries, such as in Colombia. And now I just want to finish by speaking a little about resistance and change and what is it that we're doing. So fundamentally, awareness raising, as my colleague Ben mentioned, is still a crucial dimension. Academic freedom has to be much more part of the public debate, and much more also part of the debate within actors that are pushing for democratic renewal. Research and infrastructure is fundamental. Research, monitoring, us understanding and being able to talk accurately about the problem is of fundamental importance. Collective action is our really big bet in terms of offering collective support, offering collective intelligence and strategizing, articulating nationally and regionally, internationally. and advocacy for the implementation of principles, looking at legislation, policies, and practices at national level, but also articulating, as also Ben mentioned, with institutions and universities that they too have to create their own policies, practices, and protocols. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Finally, we will hear from Bajo Apiagie Atua, the director of the African Coalition for Academic Freedom.
Thank you very much, Jesse. Pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to talk about the Africa Coalition for Academic Freedom. The coalition came into place in August 2024. And the reason behind the regionalization idea is founded in the principles of the UN, of course, which recognize regional approaches to promoting the ideals of the United Nations. So regional mechanisms were proposed because of the peculiar nature of the human rights landscape, informed by a region's history, culture, even ideology, and level of development. So the call for a relativist regional approach to promoting academic freedom is not to loosen, but to strengthen the global mechanisms for the respect for protection and fulfillment of human rights and academic freedom in each region. So long as, on the caveat that it is not exclusively done by governments, but governments working hand in hand with civil society organizations. And that is the fulcrum on which ACAF is built, working with governments and other actors within the space to promote academic freedom. In the particular context of Africa, the state of academic freedom is dictated to by the coloniality of higher education landscape, which has affected the ability of the university to realize its very raison d'etre, which is the pursuit, production, dissemination, application of knowledge. Thus, we see that in many African countries, especially after the post-Cold War situation, a number of countries have recognized for the first time academic condition in their constitutions. But on the ground, it has not translated substantively into improving the culture or respect for academic freedom. That the indicators or the forms of attacks which are being monitored on and reported by scholars as risk are prevalent in many African countries. But the focus has been on the states. However, the work of ACAF indicates that there are both internal and external violators of academic freedom on the continent, which need to be highlighted and used to determine the indicators for promoting academic freedom. Among the internal violators are the religious bodies, which my colleagues have mentioned, terror groups, ethnic and warring factions, and even organized criminal gangs operate within some university spaces and provide a threat to disturbing the congenial atmosphere for students and academics to enjoy their academic freedom. Outside the states, there are also some external actors which needs to be recognized. These include international financial institutions who, through their neoliberal economic policies prescribed for implementation, have led to corporatization, commercialization, managerialism, and commodification of knowledge within the university space. There are other actors, such as universities, scholars, and corporate institutions from the global north, where violations take place from their end through exploitative forms of internationalization, controlled funding for research, and application of what we call helicopter research, among others. ACAF, in response to these actors and factors peculiar to the continent, are prioritizing some of these activities to realize its goals. First, to monitor and document not only academic freedom violations, but also instances of measures taken to promote academic freedom in Africa, in order to provide relevant real-time data on the state of academic freedom in Africa. So monitoring and documentation is very important to the work we do. Two is to advance research on academic freedom, to identify the unique actors and factors affecting the state of academic freedom in Africa, and to design appropriate advocacy tools to deal with such violations. Three, the use of academic freedom by ECAF as a tool to promote democracy, human rights, and science for sustainable development. In other words, we express a strong link between academic freedom and these activities or processes within the country, particularly, as we said, democracy and science for sustainable development. 4 is also to provide protection or sanctuary for at-risk scholars. Most often, when scholars are at risk within the continent, they try to seek refuge in Europe and other places. But ECAF would want to ensure that these scholars are able to obtain protection within the continent so as to maintain these scholars within the continent to ensure that we're able to, it doesn't lead to brain drain, for example. And then we're also working to develop the Africa Principles on Academic Freedom. As you already know, we have the global principles developed by scholars at risk. But I want to ensure that there's the Africa one as have been developed in the Americas to reflect Africa's peculiar concerns facing academic freedom, some of which issues I've already indicated. So we are planning to work with the African Commission on Human and People's Rights to develop and formulate these principles, and ultimately to probably lead to the creation of or the adoption of a protocol on academic freedom in Africa. We're also working to revise some resolutions on the right to education, freedom of expression, and the state's obligation to regulate private sectors in the health and education sectors, which don't have references to academic freedom or only limited references to academic freedom. So working to revise these resolutions will help ensure that academic freedom finds its rightful place, as we have seen in the constitutions of many African countries. The growth of ECAF is anchored in collaboration, working with members, individual members, partners, and relevant stakeholders, including civil society actors and international organizations within and outside the continent, and to ensure that we abide by this important objective. This year, we are organizing an international conference in November that will bring all academic staff unions together across the continent so as to build coalitions and to build relationships that will enable us to identify the key challenges that affect academic freedom in each sub-region and to use that as a base to develop the Africa Principles on Academic Freedom. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Next, we will go to question and answer, and I'd like to begin by inviting Wallonia Brussels, Belgium, to ask a question.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. And first, let me congratulate the organizers for this very timely and topical event, and thank the speakers for the very insightful presentation. As you may know, for nearly 200 years now, Belgium and the Belgian Constitution has offered strong protection for both the right to education and freedom of expression, from which academic freedom derives. And the French-speaking government of Belgium has been an unwavering guardian of academic freedom as well, protecting the right to freely lead teaching, conduct research, and contribute to community service, so both inside and outside the classroom and the campuses. Our universities and university colleges have a history of promoting this culture on the campuses and outside, and they have also shown solidarity with students and academics forced to flee the countries due to threat to their lives, liberty, and well-being. Mindful of this, the importance for refugee students to access education and for scholars fleeing the countries to continue their research, they have taken several initiatives and measures. They, for instance, put in place special procedures for refugees enrolling in the programs. They have offered legal and psychosocial support, as well as preparatory programs and language classes. And several universities have created Solidarity Fund and open doctoral and postdoctoral positions for scholars who no longer have the freedom to conduct their research in the country. I am particularly glad, too, that a section Scholar at Risk Wallonia Brussels was created 2 years ago, the work of which I salute. This is a strong sign of our higher education institutions' commitment to make academic freedom a reality for all. And before concluding, I would like to just ask a few questions to the speakers, if I may. First of all, I would like to ask you all if you have noticed an impact of the higher use of social networks and online harassment on the academic freedom exercise on campuses and outside campuses. And I would also like to ask Ms. Corso, relating to the 6 attacks that you mentioned, if you have also good practices that you can mention to face this attack and to answer these attacks by scholars and universities alike. Thank you very much. Merci.
Would like to begin.
So in terms of the social media, there are actually no studies which link the level of anxiety to social media per se. Even though this is something which is repeatedly brought to my notice when I engage with youth and students, especially high school students, but even secondary school students and even lower. So I'm not sure what it is, but this is the anxious generation. They are the 2 things that come up again and again. One is the level of testing and the nature of the tests, the students. So that creates anxiety. They're fearful that they will not perform. And the second is social media. So even in countries where you have great gender equality, etc., the use of the digital engagements of social media have contributed. I don't think they are essentially the reason. I can't say that, but there are schools which are now putting your phones into little prisons. I mean, nice little pretty prisons that we saw. I'm not sure that's the solutions, because the solution is the root cause is the gender inequality and is the kind of imagery that you have. Or if you express something differently, I think that is part of academic freedom. You have to have the liberty to be different. And that's what and the students I just was speaking to are not from the third world. They're not from the South. They're from Europe and Western Europe. And they are the ones who are saying, we feel that we're numbers. We feel that we are not able to express ourselves. We can't be different from anyone. And so it's a combination of things.
So thank you for those questions. I think that in terms of social media, what we do notice in Latin America and in the Americas is really a huge amount of disinformation circulating in social media. And that definitely is a force that is affecting academic freedom, because it does put in question and it does fuel this whole anti-science movement that we are seeing. So again, you know, these are forces that are coming from, it's corporate forces as well. And the way in which there is a total deregulation of social media. So in some of our countries, we are in conversations of how is it that we can tackle this increasing amount of this flaring of disinformation and blunt lying. And the extent to which this is, like you were saying, like really articulating and pushing forward anti-science movements and questioning and blurring the boundaries of reality and fiction, which creates an environment where academic freedom is really hugely violated. In terms of positive developments that we are seeing, I think I mentioned particularly some jurisprudence. So some of the courts are actually pushing back, especially around this whole gender ideology movement that has different names. In Brazil, it's called Schools Without Parties. In other countries of Latin America, is don't interfere with my children, no te metas con mis hijos. And it affects both basic and higher education. And different countries, like in Peru, like in Colombia or Brazil, the courts are actually stepping up and working against that and pushing back. So even book banning in some of these countries, the court has managed to push back and so on and so forth. And the other positive development, I would say, is coming from the development of protocols, especially within universities, and particularly related to gender violence. gender violence is happening not just because there's a pushback in terms of gender studies, but also because women, academic women, are targeted and LGBTI communities are targeted, and it's devastating. And I do want to highlight this point at the United Nations because I do think it's a taboo issue, underlooked, understudied, and under evidenced. So, and some of the universities, such as in Colombia, because of also the Constitutional Court of Colombia, now it's obligation that all universities need to develop protocols, which doesn't mean it's a done deal because the protocols need to be implemented, but these are positive developments. And we are at CAFA trying to sort of leverage this spirit, not only to develop the protocols, but to implement them. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. In response to the place of social media and academic freedom, I would say that technology is a force for good and evil, if you can put it so. On the negative side, to start with, we realize that a number of students have not been taking their examinations and other assignments very seriously by relying on ChatGPT and so on, which in a sense does not provoke them to actually do critical research and come up with improved critical thinking skills. And so in that sense, it's a challenge. On the positive side, I would say that some students are making good use of these platforms to really come up with important ideas on research, which certainly contribute to co-creation of knowledge. And it has also helped in students in trying to determine advocacy skills to deal with human rights violations and democracy on the continent. They have been able to use these platforms to organize and to mobilize and to challenge orthodoxy and high-handedness even within the university institutions themselves, and sometimes against governments which are authoritarian in nature. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Saira. I'm from Kashmir, and here I would like to raise the right to academic freedom in the conflict areas. We have seen that in the name of national security, a lot of academic freedom is suppressed, specifically in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir, where we have seen that in the name of academic freedom, many students of PhD have been under surveillance, or the classes are under surveillance, and a curriculum is under surveillance. So what do you think that in the countries or the places where the conflict is also persistent, the academic freedom, and when we see the academic freedom index of India, it's already very low, and when there are so many militarization as well, how can we ensure that those communities over there are having our support, and how can we help them in these scenarios? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for organizing this meeting. And I would like to extend a deep appreciation for the Special Rapporteur for her principled, courageous, and necessary work in shedding light on the systematic violations of academic freedom. I think everyone here knows how horrific the situation in Palestine is, where the ongoing genocide in Gaza has led to the decimation of the majority of educational institutions and deliberate targetings of students, teachers, and academics. And what's happening in Palestine, the illegal occupation and the genocide and the devastating impact on educations are not isolated from the broader global erosion of academic freedom. And what is truly outrageous, that many Western governments who continually preach about the values and rights and freedoms remain complicit in it or actively actually supporting it. This silence and double standards, hypocritical rhetoric betray the very principles they claim to uphold. And these are the same states that suppress pro-Palestinian voices on their own campuses under the guise of neutrality or security. And we see that today education is increasingly being weaponized as a tool of colonialism, from curriculum censorship and funding cuts to the criminalization of student activism. We are witnessing a disturbing global trend where education is no longer liberates. So in light of these realities, we would like to ask what can be done to support students and young people who are courageously resisting repression on academic freedom, often at great personal risk, in both Palestine and globally, and how can we ensure that education remains a space for liberation rather than repression? Thank you.
Those are two huge questions. I welcome any responses from the panel. Yeah. We're actually about 11 minutes.
Okay. So, well, one is my current report was on safety in non-emergency situations. My next report, which we're working on now, is safety in armed conflict situations. And in that, we would be looking at putting together a policy brief. It's not going to go through documenting the horrendous things which are happening across the world because there are too many, but we will try and focus on what should be happening. In terms of the surveillance, it is probably more extreme in armed conflict and tension areas where there's tensions, but surveillance is a thing that I have underlined constantly in my reports, including in safety, including in academic freedom, including in AI, as problematic in the educational sphere, because it is creating a lack of safety. It is shutting down the spaces. If I'm always watched, then I'm not going to speak freely. I'm not going to share freely. I'm not going to be able to express myself. And I think that's happening with teachers. It's happening with the students. So it's not just in one direction. You have classrooms which are being taped now. And so the teacher feels if I'm under surveillance, I can't do this. And there's all kinds of issues related to that. I think in terms of Palestine, you know, that I have spoken about scholasticide as what is happening in Gaza, but the situation in West Bank is not that much. I mean, it's better in many ways, but the attack on education continues. So the higher education, the students, the inability, when you are unsafe, you do not go to school. When you are unsafe, you feel you're unsafe, you don't allow your children to go to school either. And I think what needs to be done, as I keep repeating, is first, the hostilities have to end. Nothing is going to be able to be done until we do that. But they are scholars who should be supported in terms of scholarships. A number of scholars from Palestine were not able to use their visas in the end. And in some of the places where they are refugees and migrants, they are not being able to continue their education. And for me, this is something which I think is important. I have written, and with many other mandate holders, we have repeatedly talked about the bravery and the courage of the students who are standing up despite being penalized for expressing their views on what is happening in Palestine. And that has happened all over the US, of course, in particular, but also in many many European states. And I'm sorry to say that the response of the states is lacking in terms of being a balance between who is saying what. And I think the students who are speaking about the atrocities in Gaza have not been treated in the same way as those who are in support of the Israeli position. Thank you.
Others on the panel? Reactions?
Thank you for the two questions. Yeah, I think that in terms of the surveillance dimensions and how can we help these communities, I think that one of the elements that I have seen as very important is to continue articulating and uniting the different actors of the education community. So a lot of the surveillance happens in a way that it pitches students against teachers. So students are often instrumentalized to tell on their teachers and to tape their teachers. And this dimension of pitching community actors one against the other is something that I have been seeing again and again in different shapes and forms. So something that I think I commend is, for example, the articulation of Education International, the Global Teacher Union, and the Global Student Forum, for example, which is happening at global level, but it happens at national level. And it's something that we should all be fostering because it is a strategy to break down the actors. So it's a huge problem, but I think that is a strategy in terms of how is it that we can help strengthening the articulation and the solidarity between students and teachers, and advocating and continuing to advocate for institutional autonomy. So really making these policies happen. So when you are taping and surveilling, you are violating that space, right? It's a demonstration of the inviolability is being infringed, and really treating this problem as not the attacks on academic freedoms are not individual problems. They are political problems, they are collective problems, and they are institutional problems. Therefore, the universities should be developing protocols, not just the gender ones that I had mentioned, but protocols on how to confront attacks. Because often what we are seeing is that they are treated as isolated cases, and the individual has all the burden to do the things, pay the costs, high expenses, and all of that. So existing protocols, creating protocols, is not just public policies, but also institutional policies, is something that I think can help. And on the question on Palestine, I think that to continue to defend the students as a body is something, the collective student movement is something for us to be pushing for and commending. Also debating this in the public to raise awareness of what you are saying. And I think that your fundamental question in terms of education spaces of liberation, that is a political problem that all of us who advocate for the right to education should really be pushing for on a daily basis. And that means influencing, for example, whatever comes after the SDGs, right? So that human rights are really underpinning any of these forums, any of the developmental agendas that are taking place. Human rights has to be at the center. And I think Farida's report, and I also speak as a Brazilian who, let's say the legacy of Paulo Freire, who has always questioned this idea, this false notion of neutrality. And I really commend Farida's report for pointing out that there is no such thing. And so, education as a space of liberation is, I think, a fundamental struggle that we solidarize and we want to embrace collectively.
Thank you. Others on the panel?
Just quickly on the issue of academic freedom in conflict situation. Yeah, I totally agree with Farida's point that the emphasis of the academic freedom and peace and democracy. I think what we need to do is to work on the education pathway for those living in conflict, because we cannot even talk about academic freedom because they don't have access to education to begin with. And I think we need to develop the pathway to education both inside the conflict area and also outside. And I'm from Thailand, so we are working to support the displaced students from Myanmar who lost their education because they are standing up against the military regime. And your Farida's point on advocating for the neighboring countries or other countries to welcome education for refugee and displaced people those without document, I think that's very important, and that's the challenge we are facing when we try to provide education for students from Myanmar. So yeah, by providing protection to the displaced student, it doesn't only provide education to them, but it's also a way to show the world that we stand by them and supporting them.
Thank you. Kwaja? Okay, we've got about 2 minutes left, so I think we'll wrap up. I guess that's my job, and it's hard to summarize such a rich conversation. I mean, there were a lot of very important points made. For me, what stands out is that I think everyone on the panel pointed out or hinted at the importance of the grassroots aspect of this. This is truly grassroots work. None of this matters if students, scholars, faculties, universities, and whole societies internalize some version of academic freedom. and recognition that these are fundamental human rights and that they matter for democracy. So, you know, I think our task is to work at you know, here, you know, from the top down, and to inspire our colleagues, our friends, our compatriots back home to recognize the same thing that we recognize, that education does have to be a space for liberation. And the way that you get there is by building solidarity between students, faculty, administrations, societies. Thank you all so much for being here, and we look forward to your further partnership.